We're now a few weeks into the new Alliance Insight format, and with the recent conclusion of YCS Providence, we also have a better idea of what some of the best decks are. So in today's video, I want to go over how to hand trap and how to counter some of the best decks in the format, which hand traps are good against them, and which key cards you should look out for. But with all that being said, let's hop straight into it. So if you haven't watched any of my previous counter guides before, the way I do it is I talk about 3 or so key cards for each specific strategy, so you know generally which cards are important to the strategy, instead of just telling you like, oh, use Ash on this, Imperm on this, or something like that. I think it's more important to know which cards are important for the strategy to proceed, so that whether you play hand traps or you just have interruptions when you go first, you have a better idea of where to use them, instead of just memorizing where to use certain hand traps in certain slots. And then also talk about some more targeted hand traps and whether or not they're good against this strategy. So starting off with Maliss, the first cards I want to talk about are of course the Link 3s, Red Ransom and White Binder being the key ones in the deck. You generally want to prevent Maliss from getting access to these Link 3s because once one of these resolves, it's just so hard to stop them from snowballing advantage from there. So I think your best shot is actually just trying to prevent them from climbing up to these links in the first place. And specifically with White Binder, you can use Ash on the effect to summon back from the banished, and you can punish some Maliss players that do choose to use their White Binder a little too aggressively. So that's something to keep in mind. The next one is Splash Mage, and now with the introduction of the Cyberse engine in the deck, most players are just using Splash Mage to link climb into their Link 3s instead of using Haggard Lizardos. Of course, Haggard is still a card, but Splash Mage can be a little bit more vulnerable to those hand traps like Imperm, and even Bystials on the target sometimes can make it so Splash Mage just doesn't get any value at all. The Cyberse lock doesn't particularly matter for the deck because most of their extenders are now Cyberse, but I think it's just good to know that the main way that they use to climb up into their Link 3s now is Splash Mage. So just be aware that outside of Splash Mage, the next best way I think is like Haggard, I guess, if people are still playing that. And of course SP Little Knight, but that one is a little bit harder to go into than Splash Mage. And then finally, I want to talk about Backup at Ignister and Cyberse Wicked especially. This is now a new part of their combo where they use Cyberse Wicked to banish a piece from the graveyard to add Backup at Ignister because it is a tuner. And I just wanted to highlight how powerful this is because Backup at Ignister alone is an extra 3 bodies. This is also the card that lets them play through cards like Lancia because the backup allows them to just generate so many bodies on the board without ever having to banish cards. So I think that trying to cut them off of access to backup or even cutting off access to Cyberse Wicked can make it so their end board is greatly reduced. That being said though, it's not like the deck can't play without the Ignister cards, and it's not like if you stop them you'll instantly win. So just be aware that even though the stopping the backup at Ignister is really strong, it's not going to outright shut out their turn because the Maliss cards can still put up a lot on their own. But I do think it's worth talking about since this is one of their new key extenders and one you do want to watch out for, especially if you're playing cards like Lancia and Chaos Hunter to stop them. And then in this section, I'm going to talk about some very specific targeted hand traps and whether or not they're good against Maliss. So I'm not going to be talking about cards like Ash, Imperm, things like that, because I think those generally have some applications against most of the decks on this list, but some more specific hand traps that may or may not be higher impact against Maliss. So starting off with Shifter, this card doesn't do anything against them. They can definitely play with all their cards banished. Droll and Lockbird, I think players generally agree that this card is not very good against Maliss, and I'm also inclined to agree, but the reason I put it as like mid is because there is some world where your opponent will have to activate like a spell like Allure of Darkness or AI Meet You at the start of their turn, and then afterwards they don't get value off of their Cyberse Wicked, they don't get value off of their Backup at Ignister, they won't get value off of their Red Ransom as well. And that is a lot of advantage that the deck's losing. Not to mention the multitude of draws that it gets during the turn as well. You can easily cut off a draw 3 during their turn with Droll and Lockbird. So while Droll won't completely shut out their turn, I do think it has some merit to see main deck play this format. And even against Maliss, it's not a terrible card because at least it can cap the end board that they're ending on. All that being said though, Droll and Lockbird is never going to be enough on its own to stop Maliss, but it isn't too bad when paired with some other hand traps. Speaking of hand traps that are good into Maliss, I think Artifact Lancia is definitely still very powerful. The deck does still have issues against Lancia when it doesn't see access to the backup at Ignister, and it's still going to hurt Maliss like it did in previous formats. You do want to use Artifact Lancia in the draw phase or standby phase now to play around a card like Allure of Darkness or March Hare, but outside of that, Lancia hasn't really changed against Maliss. It's still a really powerful card against them. Next up is Nib. I think Nib is very mid against Maliss. It's never going to do enough alone because their normal one-card combos can already play through Nibiru. You will have to pair Nibiru with a couple of other hand traps for it to be really effective, and just hope that they haven't like hard drawn the backup or the wizard to keep playing from there. I do think Nib can have potential against Maliss, but you really do need to play other hand traps too. Next up are the Bystials. I think the Bystials are not good against them. There is one spot you can use them on, and it's where your opponent goes Splash Mage targeting a Maliss in the graveyard. But I think most of the time that Maliss won't have used its effect to summon back from the banish. So even though you cut off the Splash Mage access, in reality you're just cutting off a single body, and they can just reduce their board slightly and still end on a pretty much unbreakable board regardless. So I'm pretty sure the Bystials aren't that good against Maliss. And then for the 3 Charmies, I think all these are actually meh against Maliss. I would say Fuelos is probably the best out of these, but Maliss does have a way to make some very powerful half boards with only giving 1 or 2 draws and playing with a bunch of follow-up afterwards along with other hand traps. So while I do think that these cards are very good, I feel like you really need to have like combinations of these cards with like other hand traps that make it really awkward for your opponent to play. Otherwise, they can still put up a pretty formidable half board without giving too many draws if they are only affected by a single copy of Purulia, Fuelos, or Meowth. That being said, though, people are definitely maining these in this format, and I think that's definitely correct. They are very good, but I just feel like you need more than just a single copy of any of these Charmies for it to really be effective. The next deck I want to talk about is Ryzeal. This is specifically for if you want to hit the Ryzeal part of the deck. I know there are different variants of Ryzeal, and I'll talk more about those other engines later on in the video. But for now, this is just like the Ryzeal part of the deck if you wanted to hit it. The first one, of course, is still going to be Ryzeal Duo Drive. This is probably their main card you want to use your Imperms Veilers on. It just gets them so much advantage if it's able to resolve, getting them access to Cross and another extender. Just make it so their advantage just snowballs out of control from there. So you could also save an Imperm for Detonator because they're not always going to be able to set up an Eclipse Twins under it. There are going to be some hands where your opponent isn't able to do that, and a card like Imperm can trade pretty well into Detonator still. Another route you can go now is hitting the main deck monsters. I think this is a little bit more reasonable now because there are less copies of the main deck monsters that people are going to be able to play. So I think it's going to be less likely that your opponent will simply just have drawn the extra extender after, let's say, you imperm their normal summon. Speaking of normal summoning, I want to point out Sword Ryzeal in particular because they start with normal summoning Sword Ryzeal. You can pretty confidently know that your opponent doesn't have any other Ryzeal name in their hand, and if you're able to stop the Sword Ryzeal, then you should be good. Finally, I want to talk about Ryzeal Cross. Of course, his on-field effect is really good, but I want to point out now that Detonator's at 1, a lot of Ryzeal's follow-up comes from Ryzeal Cross. If you're able to remove the Cross after it's on the board for a single turn, Ryzeal actually has the potential to run out of names in the deck, and some variants won't ever be able to get back into the Detonator because they don't play cards like Ryzeal Plugin. They'll have to really go out of their way to resolve an X sending Eclipse Twins and trying to resolve Eclipse Twins to get the Detonator back. So I think cutting off Cross can be pretty good to really hinder the grind game of the deck. And now talking about some key hand traps against Ryzeal, I think Shifter is not very good. The deck can play through it pretty confidently. Of course, X doesn't work under Shifter, but I feel like most of the time Ryzeal either has enough non-engine to live through the Shifter, or they have a supplementary engine that doesn't really care too much about Shifter. I think Droll is pretty good against Ryzeal. They do have a lot of effects to search. All their little level 4s do search before they get to make a card like Duo Drive. So being able to cut off Duo Drive I think is pretty important for the deck. It's effectively as if you just like used Ash and Imperm on the Duo Drive. Not to mention you do cut off cross access as well in the cross draw, which can be really good. And plus a lot of the times Ryzeal this format is going to be paired with Mitsurugi. So I think that Droll is going to be very impactful against this deck and its variants. Nancy is not very good against this deck. That doesn't really ever banish anything. Nib, I think, is very mid as well. You do need to pair it with other hand traps for it to be really effective. Similar case as with when I was talking about Maliss. The Bystials are also not very good against the Ryzeal deck. Like, I think the only use case of it is like if you're somehow able to force the Detonator to pop itself, and then when they use Eclipse Twins to target the Detonator and something else, you can banish the Detonator there. But I feel like in those cases, the Bystials will have lost so much value by then because your opponent's Detonator will have presumably been able to pop a few cards by then, or at the very least they'll have a cross on the field to negate the Bystial. That I just don't think the Bystials are worth playing against Ryzeal. I think Purulia is okay. It is going to be pretty impactful against some hands in Ryzeal. Like if your opponent starts with like X or something, it's probably going to be really good against them. But then if your opponent just goes ahead and normals Ice, there is a world where they only give you like the single draw for the normal summon and just end on a Detonator. That's not the worst thing ever, I think. And similar idea with Fuelos. There is the possibility for them to just end on a single Detonator and sort of just give you a single draw. Now, single Detonator doesn't seem like that much, but it can still be really threatening and very difficult for a lot of the decks to remove if they don't specifically see non-engine to remove it. So while I do think that these cards are very good, I just feel like you need to make sure that you have a way to out like their one detonator after you drop this card on them, because if you just have a single Molcharmi and your engine just folds through a detonator, then I still think that the Ryzeal player is not in a terrible spot even if you hit them with these cards. Meowth is just not very good. The deck just never summons from the banish or the graveyard except for Node, and they don't have to do that in their combos. Next big deck of the format is going to be Mitsurugi. This deck did really well at the YCS, and I think these cards are some of the craziest cards we've gotten in recent memory. The main card you want to stop is Mitsurugi Ritual. This is their broken ritual spell that lets them ritual summon from deck or ritual summon from hand by like dumping stuff from the deck. So you just want to cut off access to Mitsurugi Ritual. And the way that they get to the ritual is with Habakiri to summoning Saji, and then Saji effect grabbing the spell. So you essentially just want to use cards like Ash Blossom on Saji to prevent them from getting Ritual. Or if they normal Saji, you want to use Imperm on that. Like, you just don't want them to get Mitsurugi Ritual into rotation. And of course, if you can play cards like Dominus Impulse as well, hitting the Ritual is going to be really powerful. Outside of their Ritual, though, I do want to talk about two of their other key cards being Mitsurugi Prayers and Amino Murakumo. Mitsurugi Prayers is one of the most powerful quick play spells we have in the game right now. It acts as consistency, extension for the deck, and it allows them to play around a lot of targeting hand traps like Imperm and stuff like that. Lets them play through draw during the draw phase. There's just so many good things about Prayers, and when Prayers is paired with something like Murakumo, they can simply tribute the Murakumo on your turn, and then it'll come back and wipe your board out, all while giving them extra advantage. So you do want to watch out for Prayers tributing Murakumo. That's sort of the main way that they get interruption on your turn. And then for the hand traps that are good against Mitsurugi, I think Shifter is okay against them. They do have ways to add back from the banish, but they only usually play a single copy of Kusanagi, and Kusanagi is only once per turn. So if you are able to force them to try to go into Kusanagi and Kusanagi somehow gets banished, then they do lose those resources forever. But all that being said, though, I do think that the deck is flexible enough to simply just not commit that much under Shifter or commit resources that aren't super important. So I don't think that Shifter is going to be very good against them. Draw is one of the best cards against Mitsurugi, even though they have Prayers to play around it in the draw phase. This deck just searches so much in engine that hitting them with a single copy of Draw and Lockbird can simply just cut off their engine completely at times. Lancia is not good. They don't really ever banish any cards. Nib, I don't think is very good against specifically the Mitsurugi part, because not only do they rarely ever summon that many times, even if they do end on a ritual that if you tribute it with Nibiru, it has the effect to just search and revive itself. I don't think Nibiru does anything to specifically the Mitsurugi side of any deck. I think Bystials are fine. Like, they're not great, but they're not terrible either. There are going to be times where your opponent will tribute off like a ritual with Prayers for cost, and then if you hit them with the Bystial there, it can be really powerful. But outside of that, I don't think there's any really other good use cases for the Bystials against the Mitsurugi cards. I just feel like you'd rather see some other hand traps against them. And then for the three Molcharmis, I think all of them are pretty mid into Mitsurugi. All of them have the potential to give you like 1 or 2 draws, but I think that's the most you'll pretty much ever get from them. The Mitsurugi engine can just play with very few actions. Like, they can simply just do a single ritual summon and be set up for like your turn, and they don't necessarily have to commit very hard into the Molcharmis. Now, the reason I put them as mid is because it can have the potential to really limit the ceiling of the deck. In a lot of the times, the Mitsurugi deck can keep ritual summoning aggressively throughout the turn, even up to 3 times. But under the Molcharmis, they probably will choose to stop and just give you like a single draw, but it will severely weaken their end board. So I do think that the Molcharmis are probably okay against them, but I wouldn't rely on them to carry me through the game. Next up is Memento, and even though I don't think a single Memento topped Providence, I do think that Memento is still a very scary deck, so I think it's good to know what key cards to hit against them. I know every time I play against this deck, I have to read a million cards, and it's really annoying to try to remember all the effects, so I just want to sort of compile, I guess, what I felt were the 3 most important things to consider against them. The first one is like the main monster you want to stop, Tatsunoto Shigo. This is their monster that lets them summon itself for free and then pop itself to dump pretty much up to 3 Memento monsters from their deck to the graveyard, and those Memento monsters have effects in the grave. So you do want to use your interruptions like Ash and Imperm and stuff on Tatsunoto Shigo. A caveat with that is that they do play a slew of quick play spells like Bone Party and Grand Breakout that can help them dodge the targeting interruptions, and their in-engine Memento Fusion also dodges targeting interruptions. So you do need to be careful about how you choose to use your Imperms and Veilers and stuff like that. Maybe you can consider doing it on Summon of Tatsuno Shigo instead, just so you can play around these cards a little bit better. The next thing I want to talk about is like the Fusion spell and Sleepy. This is a Fusion deck, and they do have 2 Fusion monsters that they want to cycle through every single every single turn. And I think that if you're able to cut off access to fusion summoning for them, they have to really rely on the Fiendsmith engine that they're playing, and the Memento cards don't really do that much if they aren't able to get to the fusion monsters. Not to mention, Memento Fusion has one of the most broken, I think, graveyard effects right now, and if you're able to stop them from getting access to this spell in the first place, I think you'll be in a really good spot. Sleepy is their other in-engine way to fusion summon, and if you're able to prevent them from getting access to this too, I think it can be really good. There's one final way they can fuse, and that's Proxy F Magician, but I think Proxy F Magician is just a lot worse than both of these, so you want to mainly focus on stopping their in-engine ways to fuse, in my opinion. And then finally, like I mentioned, Bone Party and Grand Breakout. These are just cards that let them dodge targeting effects, so it can be really difficult to use your targeting interruption against them. And there is some world where you can choose to simply try to hold cards like Impermanent stuff for the next turn to use on their end board pieces like Caesar. Do keep in mind that they do play upwards of 9 quick play spells to dodge these targeting effects on their monsters. And then Handtraps against Memento. Shifter is really good against them. This is a very graveyard-centric deck, and losing stuff to the Banish Zone just makes it really hard for the deck to play. I think Droll is okay against them. I feel like most of the time Memento is probably going to be able to play through the Droll and Lockbird fine. It is a deck that does add a lot of cards from its deck to its hand. So I think Droll is still pretty solid against them, but it's not something I think will usually be enough on its own to win you the game. Lancia is not very good against them either. Their only banishing effect, I think, comes from Memento Fusion, and by that point, if it gets to the graveyard, I think you're in a pretty bad spot. Nibiru, I think, is also very mid against them. You're going to need to pair this with other hand traps for it to really have an impact. The deck's engine just naturally plays through it, so unless you're able to cut their engine off from a lot of their starters and extenders, the Nib is probably not doing much. I think that the Bystials are also pretty mid against them. There's one good spot I think you can Bystial, and that's when they send Gaddock to the graveyard. Gaddock essentially has the effect to revive itself and then add a Memento back from the graveyard, and hitting Gaddock out of play can essentially be like a 2-for-1 almost, and that can be pretty solid against them. They do have a few other dark monsters, and if they do play the Fiendsmith engine, the Bystials are still going to be pretty solid, but I think in general the Bystials just aren't super high impact against the Memento engine itself. I personally think that Perulia can be pretty good against Memento. They do have a lot of effects that can summon from the hand, and I think Fulos is also pretty solid against them too. They do have quite a few effects that summon from the deck and extra deck, and if they do play the Fiendsmith engine, then Fulos is just going to be really strong to them as well. I think Maliss is okay against them. They do have some effects to summon back from the graveyard, but I don't think they have to go through that many to set up their full combo. Maybe they'll give you like a single draw off of it and still go full combo. So I don't think Maliss is going to be very good, but maybe if you pair it with some other cards, you can force them to try to pivot into their Fiendsmith engine, and then that give you an extra draw or something off the Maliss. Next up is Mermail. I think Mermail is still one of the scariest decks of the format, and their main card is going to be Neptibus. This is the one that sends a water for cost and then adds another one, so essentially they get a +2 off of this, which is kind of crazy. You want to cut them off of getting access to Atlantean Prince, and you pretty much want to stop this card from ever resolving its effect. So if you have cards like Book of Moon or a Pop on Summon, something like that, just to get rid of it, I think that's something you want to go for. And then next thing I want to talk about are the cards that Neptibus is actually sending. So Dragoons and Shadow Squad. Shadow Squad lets them summon a Mermail, summon a Atlantean from their main deck, which is going to be Neptibus. So I think, for example, if your opponent goes like Water, discard Shadow Squad, and then Shadow Squad attempt to summon, you could use your Ash Blossom there to stop them from getting access to the Prince. Similarly, if your opponent goes like Water, discard Dragoons, and the Dragoons effect to attempt to add a Sea Serpent, you could stop the Dragoons as well. You pretty much just never want them to get access to Neptibus, and I think if there's one thing you take away from this, it's just stop the Neptibus from coming out. And the last thing I want to talk about is Abyss Rhine. This is their main extender that allows them to play through hand traps. Like, let's say you've hand trapped them a few times and they just have just like random bodies on the board. Abyss Rhine can just like tribute itself and one of them to summon out Coelacanth, and the Coelacanth, by discarding a card, can essentially emergency teleport out 4 different fish from the deck. Pretty much their main way of playing through low impact hand traps. And I think you just want to know that, hey, if you're able to stop the Neptibus, that's great, but you also need to be aware that Abyss Rhine could have the potential to just summon Coelacanth and sort of let them pop up from there still. Some key hand traps versus Mermail. I think that Shifter is obviously very good. It is a very graveyard centric deck. Droll and Lockbird I also think is really good. This deck can get so many surges in a turn off of Dragoons that I think that hitting them with Droll, while it won't always be turn ending, it definitely is impactful enough for me to consider it to be a very good hand trap against Mermail. Lancia is not very good against them. I think the only card that they have that banishes is Minstrel, and I guess later on the combo, Trishula may banish a card from your hand as well. But I feel like at that point, you rather have other hand traps that are just going to stop them from getting to that spot in the first place. Nib, like all the other decks I mentioned, you need to pair this with something else. Their engine is naturally pretty good into Nib, I think. Even though they did lose Toad, I think that they still have lines that allow them to play relatively safely under Nib if that's the only hand trap you have. Bystials aren't very good. They only play water monsters. I think Perulia is very good against them. A lot of their extenders are summoned from the hand, so cards like Abystius and stuff. And not to mention the Poseidon, the Storming Atlantean, a lot of them will summon from the hand. Fulos is also pretty good against them. Hits cards like Shadow Squad. They do go into the extra deck quite a bit for their full combo as well. So I think that both Perulia and Fulos are pretty high impact against them. Maliss doesn't really do anything against them. They don't have many cards that summon from the graveyard. Next up are Fiendsmith variants. I want to keep this one pretty short and simple because you've probably seen it before, but I think hitting their Link monsters is pretty important. If you have like Ash, use it on Requiem. It could completely cut them off from the engine during that turn. Hitting Sequence with Imperm can also be pretty good because otherwise Desiree is just going to be able to trade super well into your Imperm. That being said though, they don't make Sequence that often now. I think they usually go for a Wave High King Caesar, so you could save your Imperm for cards like that as well if it's really good against your deck. And then finally, just a quick reminder that of course, if they have Lacrima and Requiem in the graveyard, it is an interruption because they can go Lacrima, summon the Requiem, Requiem summon Lacrima, Lacrima dump Paradise on your turn, and then Paradise can send Desiree to send a card on the field. So just be aware that this is an extra layer of interruption that the Fiendsmith engine has. Cards that are good against Fiendsmith, Shifter obviously is really good. They do rely very heavily on the graveyard. Droll I think is mid. I think the only reason I put it as mid and not bad is because there is that case where if your opponent starts with discard Engraver, Search, Tract, and hitting them with Droll there can be really good if they just have no other way into their Fiendsmith engine. It could completely cut them off because they aren't able to activate the Tract. But other than that, I don't think against the Fiendsmith card specifically, Droll does anything at all. Lancia is obviously not very good against them. They don't have any cards that banish. Nib is also very mid against them. Not because it doesn't necessarily do anything. Like if you nib them on their regular one card combo, they're not really ending with anything other than Lacrima in the graveyard. But I think the problem is that they still have access to the engine on the next turn through Lacrima, and they get a lot of follow up off the Fiendsmith cards. So your nib essentially doesn't do that much aside from trade with the potential Caesar that they're making. And while that can be good for some decks, I just feel like nib in general is not going to be that great against Fiendsmith. You probably want cards like the Bystials instead, which can actually hit the Fiendsmith monsters out of the graveyard. Perulia is just not very good against them. They can go into the engine usually without normal summoning at all if they just hard draw Tract or hard draw Engraver. Fua is very good against the Fiendsmith engine. They're going to need to summon from the extra deck a lot in order to get their full engine going. Like there is a world where they could just, let's say, summon Lurie and then you Fua them there. They are forced to pretty much just make a Requiem and give you a draw and pass, and then all the Requiem can do on their turn is summon Lacrima, and then Lacrima dumps Fiendsmith in Paradise, which can still be decent, but Fua is definitely very good against the engine because it prevents them from really popping off with it. Maliss, I think, is pretty bad against them. They only really have the Engraver effect to summon itself back from the grave, but by then their engine is already going, so Maliss is just not really good. Next up is Blue Eyes. I think one Blue Eyes did manage to top Providence, and I'm going to quickly skim over this as well because I did cover it in a previous video. But the main card they want to go for is Maiden of White and True Light. True Light is how they get their follow-up and extension every single turn, and Maiden lets them get to True Light, so you want to cut them off of access to those. Wishes for Eyes of Blue is going to be their main spell card that they get off of True Light, and it's going to be their main consistency piece. So you want to hit this card with cards like Ash Blossom or Dominus Purge, because not only is that -1 for them, it also cuts them off of the two of their main engine pieces. And then finally, I want to talk about the Primite engine. This is one of the best grind engines in the game, and I think that Blue Eyes is scary because they're able to play the Primite cards. Drill Beam is still a pretty crazy card even in today's format. If your deck struggles a lot with getting access to Drill Beam, being able to cut off, let's say, a Lord effect to search can be pretty impactful. Just be aware that the Primite engine does give the Blue Eyes stuff a ton of follow-up. Cards that are good against Blue Eyes, Shifter is really good. They do benefit a lot from having their cards in the graveyard. I think Droll is also really good against this deck. A lot of the times their turn is going to start with either Wishes or they're going to start with Sage Searching Maiden, and hitting them with Droll there can be pretty solid. It's not like they have no place through Droll, but it will cut off access to the field spell. It will cut off future Stage Searches, so I think it is pretty high impact against Blue Eyes. Lancet's not very good against them. They don't have any cards that banish. Nib is also very mid against them. You do need to pair it with other cards, I think, for it to be impactful. And even then, the deck has ways to play around Nib inherently by having access to a card like Heretic Seals. So I don't think Nib is too great against them. The Bystials are pretty good. Being able to hit Maiden out of the graveyard or the OG Blue Eyes can make it so they aren't able to climb up into their synchros. Perulia is not very good against them. I think yes, you can argue that like they will normal summon once from hand, and then they maybe will use the additional normal summon, but I think that a lot of the times they don't have to give you that second draw off of Purulia when they search their field spell and use their additional normal summon. They can just give you one for their regular normal summon and go from there. Fu, I think, is okay against them. It will severely limit the ceiling of this deck, I think, but there is a world where they can just pass with giving you like a single draw for making a single copy of Spirit or something, and Spirit can be pretty problematic for some decks still. Maliss, I think, is not very good against them. They don't necessarily have to play in a way that summons a lot from the graveyard. They can, but I think some of their lines don't necessarily require them to summon a lot from the grave, so Maliss just probably isn't going to be that good against them in my opinion. And then the final deck I want to talk about is Evil Twin. This did get new support in the set, and I think one of them did manage to top Providence. I think the scariest new card that they get access to is Kiss Kill Deal. Not only is its effect scary, making it so every time you respond to their Evil Twin monster, they get to draw a card, but it is also Light Fiend, which means at any point if you just hand trap their regular combo, they can simply just turn one of their extenders into Kiss Kill Deal, and then they have full access to the Fiendsmith engine there. So this deck can be pretty hard to hand trap because of this card. Trouble Sunny is one of their main in-engine endboard pieces. It's going to be able to summon out 2 guys from the graveyard, which will pop 1 and draw 1. If you are able to stop this card with cards like Call by the Grave or Dominance Impulse, is something you do want to save those cards for, I think, because this is a very big part of their end board and a pretty big part of their follow-up as well. So I think being able to cut this off is pretty important. And finally, I wanted to talk about specifically the Live Twin extenders. I wouldn't really recommend trying to hand trap like the small Live Twin monsters, the ones that just summon another copy of itself from the deck, because I think this deck has so many different extenders that they're just always going to be able to play through a low impact hand trap like Imperm or something like that. I think you want to save your non-engine for the other cards that I mentioned at the start. And Kiss Kill Frost specifically I want to talk about because it is a Kiss Kill monster, which lets them make Kiss Kill Deal. And it does have the secret effect to where if you add a card from your deck to your hand and they control an Evil Twin monster, the Evil Twin player gets to draw a card. So that is just something to be aware of. And then finally, hand traps that are good against Evil Twin. I think Shifter is really good. They do rely a lot on their graveyard for bringing guys back to Link Climb with. Droll, I think, is okay against them. They do have a few cards that will search and draw, but I don't feel like it's usually going to be enough to stop them. I think the only really impactful time you can use Droll against them is when they start with Secret Password, which essentially just adds a search spell. So if you are able to Droll them there, I guess that's pretty good. But in most cases, I don't think Droll is going to be very good against this deck. Lancia's not very good. They don't really banish any cards from their deck. Nib is also very mid. Like I mentioned with all the previous decks, like you really need other hand traps to pair with Nibiru for it to be impactful. Bystials are pretty good against them, not only because they play the Fiendsmith stuff, but in engine, their disruptions require them to summon other light monsters back from the graveyard, so hitting them there with Bystials can turn off interruptions and extenders for them. I think Purulia's okay against them. They're pretty much always going to give you one for their normal summon, and a few of their extenders do summon from the hand, but I don't think they necessarily have to use those extenders. So unless you pair Purulia with like some other hand traps, I don't think that it's going to be super impactful. Fula, on the other hand, is pretty impactful on its own. This deck just summons so many times from the main deck and extra deck. If you're able to resolve a Fulos against them, it can be really powerful. They don't really have a good half end board that they can end on. And then finally, Maliss is also really good against them. Their main engine consists of them using the Link 2s to revive stuff back from the graveyard, and they need to do that a few times in order to keep Link climbing in their combo. And not to mention, Engraver also does play into Maliss too. So I think in general, Fulos and Maliss are probably going to be the best small charmies against this deck. Before I end off the video, I just want to give a quick shout out to CardTrader and Your Playmat. You can check them out using my links in the description. Sign up using my affiliate links to help support the channel, and use code tcgsam to get 5% off the things that you'd already be buying anyways. But with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. Do you think I missed anything? Do you think I missed any important decks? If so, what hand traps would you use against them, and what cards would you choose to hit against them? I'm curious to hear what you think. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.